started, on behalf of the UNCF Koch Scholars Program and the Center for Innovation and Entrepreneurship, we welcome you to our next Power Suite, Reaching the C-Suite in Your 30s. On behalf of myself, Quincy Inman, and Troy Blyther, we are glad that you're able to join us, and we look forward to finishing out the rest of this semester as we reach the close of this semester. Today, we have our speakers. We have Shaquan Lewis, and we also have a guest interviewer and one of your fellow cohort in Miss Brittany Lacroix from Spelman University, who will be running the question and answers today. But just as an introduction, Mr. Shaquan Lewis is the Chief Operating Officer for Pizza Hut USA. He leads the charge in delivering end-to-end customer experiences through delivery-focused operations and best-in-class restaurant technology. Shaquan previously held other leadership roles in the company since 2016. More recently, he served as Chief Equity Officer, where he championed, promoted, and guided the company's equity and inclusion vision, strategy, and other initiatives across Pizza Hut's footprint as a franchisor, employer, and community pillar. Prior to that, he was a Senior Director of Express, leading the team responsible for the license of approximately 1,500 locations in airports, stadiums, military bases, Target stores, movie theaters, and transportation centers. Before that, he served as Director of Legal, leading the company's efforts in franchising. He'll tell you more about himself as he introduces himself. Ms. Brittany Lacroix is a Florida native attending Spelman College with plans to graduate in May of this year. As a political science major, Brittany aspires to attend law school, but will be entering the financial services industry post-graduation. Again, housekeeping notes, please turn your cameras off. Make sure your full names are reflected on the screen, and please make sure to pay attention as the content will be included in a quiz and discussion. Now we will have Mr. Shaquan Lewis talk a little about his journey from Texas to Pizza Hut. And then we will have Miss Brittany Lacroix, who will conduct a series of interview questions with Mr. Lewis. Mr. Lewis, take us away.
Appreciate that, Edward. Hey, what's going on, everybody? Glad to be here with you. I'm going to be quick because I actually would much rather talk with Brittany and hear your questions than to ramble on, but I'll give you a little bit of context. So Edward said from Texas to Pizza Hut, and the reality is my whole story actually starts in Mississippi. So if I'm ever going to give it to anybody straight, I start with that. So, you know, I grew up in Texas, but all my family's in Mississippi. So outside of Jackson, the Canton area, the Florida area, my mom and my dad are from there. And my story really begins with my grandfather. So my grandfather from Florida, on my paternal side, he was a sharecropper, and he had stopped going to school in the 3rd grade because he had to make sacrifices to take care of a ton of people his whole life. I was fortunate to see a lot of it. His whole life was dedicated to what he could do for someone else. One of the big lessons I got from my grandfather is you always have something else to give somebody. So that's a critical thing for me. My other grandfather on my mom's side was from Canton, and he was in the 101st Airborne in the Korean War. So this is a guy that was scared of flying, but he would jump out of the planes behind enemy lines. That was my granddad. And from him, I had this idea of, and actually I'll tell you, he went on to become a school teacher. So he taught biology for 32 years, taught all my aunts and my uncles and my mom on that side. And even though their stories are so different, this idea of a concept of sacrifice was deeply embedded in me because these were my examples. And they passed these things on to my mom, passed them on to my dad. And at every step that I've made in my career, whether it's from a school perspective, whether it's from a community engagement perspective, certainly from a professional perspective, I come at it with the lens of service. And I hope we get a chance to unpack that together. I made the choice to go to Howard, coming out of where I live in Texas. So I grew up in the Fort Worth area, a little town called Watauga, which is just north of Fort Worth. You can see the Fort Worth line from where I grew up, live in Dallas today, but made a choice to go to Howard coming out of high school. It's a critical choice for me. It's maybe the most, at least one of the 2 or 3 most important choices I made, because it was probably the most formative time in my life. I look forward to talking about that and what I think the proposition is that HBCU stand for in particular. I'm a proud HBC graduate. I'm a proud Howard graduate. My family is an HBC family. So that whole Mississippi side, they all went to Tougaloo. And it ended up not being my school of choice, but it's the family school. And so Howard was my way of extending the HBC legacy. At Howard, I studied poli-sci and econ. I think I heard Brittany say that she studies poli-sci as well. I knew I wanted to go to law school, but before I went to law school, I made a decision to have a business career. My dad, being the cat that grew up picking cotton before he could go to school, told me I need to go get a real job before I paid some more people to teach me something. So I went and worked before I went to law school. I worked at this company called McMaster Car Supply Company. I was one of the kids they hired onto the management team that expressly did not come from business, but they thought that, I was one of those groups of folks that could ask good questions and come in and challenge the status quo and figure out ways to solve problems differently. And that worked out pretty well. I was fortunate. I started in the Atlanta office, and after 2 years, I got promoted up to headquarters to the Chicago office. And in the Chicago space, I went from, leading a significant part of our warehouse operations into standing up some diversity work, actually. And that has followed me throughout my career as well, and ended my time there running the national employment operations for that whole company. Then went to law school, enjoyed law school. Actually, I hated the first year, but the second year and the third year were pretty phenomenal. Met my wife, who has given me 2 wonderful children at law school. We were classmates. And then I went into the practice of big law. Spent about 4 years in big law. Happy to talk about what that experience was like as well, but decided that I really didn't want to be a lawyer anymore. And so I pivoted my story and went to Pizza Hut, actually. So I was a book it kid growing up. One of the ways that I got pizza was book it, actually. We always had enough, but we weren't in the situation where we just have whatever we wanted. And so for me, reading was a way to activate not only my brain, but like my love of pizza. Because when I walked in there with a booking certificate, it was like I had the big joker in spades or something like that. And that followed me. And so when this job opportunity came up at Pizza Hut, I took it because in a lot of respects, it felt like going home. So I took a job as a lawyer at Pizza Hut. And the legal job I had was very different than the legal job I had at Baker Botts, the big firm I was at. So at Pizza Hut, I moved from being a litigator to a transaction lawyer, basically. So I had to reframe my entire practice. So now I'm engaged in mergers and acquisitions. Now I am drafting franchise agreements. Now I'm enforcing our franchise agreements. I'm drafting development agreements to help us grow the brand. But I knew that I didn't want to be a lawyer forever. And I was fortunate enough to be at a company that told me, when I came in, I said, do you want to be a CEO one day? Or do you want to be a chief legal officer? And my honest answer was a CEO. And so they said, come in and take this job, do it well, and we'll make whatever is possible for your reality. And so after about 2.5 years in that legal role, I went and took over the non-traditional business. We call it Pizza Hut Express. So you see it in like movie theaters and Targets and on college campuses. I know we got one in Jackson State and some other places. And that was my first time running a P&L, a profit and loss center. And that was a really good learning experience. After that, I got asked to take another challenge on, which was standing up our equity, inclusion, and belonging work. That was a really interesting choice for me. It's work that I knew was important, but I had avoided for a really long time because I had some concerns about being pigeonholed as a Black man doing that work in corporate America. But I took it because I had a vision for what it looked like to do it the right way, in an intentional way. And then after that, I've been transitioning into the role I'm in now, which is the chief operating officer. So in this role, I still have a vision for service. So all along the way, my organizing mantra is every restaurant should be a pathway to greater possibility for all the folks that work in it. So when I walk into one of our 7,000 restaurants, from the traditional size to the express size, every time I go in and shake a hand or give somebody a pound, I'm looking at someone who I'm concerned with making sure that they can go from point A to point Z and that their life is better because they worked at Pizza Hut. So that's what I've been working on. That's my story, sort of in a nutshell. And Brittany, why don't we wrap a little bit now and get into this thing?
Well, one thing you missed is where you went to law school.
I went to Harvard for law school.
The other HU.
The other one. That's right.
Yes. Well, Mr. Lewis, thank you so much for joining us here today. I've already heard so many amazing things, and I know you touched a little bit about your experience at Howard, but what do you believe that receiving a degree at an HBCU, how do you feel like that sets you apart in your career life?
Yeah, it's a good question. I'm really glad you started there because it's important to me, especially at a time where you can't go to school in HBCU without having to worry about bomb threats and all this other type of foolishness, right?
Right.
So I'll tell you two things. For me, it was an opportunity, Brittany, for me to find myself. So I knew who Shaquan was, but I always had a difficult time in the if I'm keeping it 100, the incredibly white world that I grew up in, having a hard time really contextualizing myself. Like the person I'm as likely to quote Tupac as I am Plato. I have, I like to do hood stuff, and I also like to do things that don't seem like that.
Right.
And I had always had a hard time being all those things in that white space because I was told you're either supposed to be this or you're supposed to not be that. And importantly, I was almost always alone, like especially in the honors program, right? So me choosing to go to Howard was one, trying to extend my family legacy of going to HBCUs. I'd seen the impact that it had on them. But for me, I needed to know that I could be all of these things that I was and recognize that that's not a contradiction. I just wasn't exposed to a lot of the people that were like me. So when I got to Howard, I saw a ton of kids who were both brilliant and they were going right to the club as soon as Friday night hit. You know what I mean? Who cared deeply about political activism and then also wanted to play spades in the yard and step and do this type of stuff. And so it was so important for me to see myself in that way and the fullness of what Blackness was, that was critical. The second piece was that fullness of Blackness. I had not had a ton of exposure to all the things it means to be in the Black diaspora, right? So when you get to Howard, you literally going to school with like dope boys from Atlanta, Black boys from Brooklyn, and princes from Nigeria. Like that's all in the same space. And for me, that was category breaking because Blackness had been presented to me in a particular way. I grew up in the South, like that's my story. And I got to see all the things that we are. And then the last thing I'd say is there's a deeply rich experience about going to an HBCU that comes from two places. One, it was more intellectually rigorous than outsiders understand. And a big reason when that was the case was because my professors saw potential in me. They cared about my future and they did not let up on me. They relentlessly pushed me towards greater possibility, like I talked about with our restaurants. And then the last piece of that is it's a different feeling being instructed by people who know they could be your mother or your father or your aunt and your uncle. And the investment that I experienced from my professors really, I've not had any experience like, and I've had great professors at Harvard Law School, both Black and white and everything in between. But the care and concern that the Howard body wrapped me in is something I wouldn't replace for the world. So as I say, truthfully, a lot of times, like when I do an interview or something like that, people want to talk about my law school, and I intentionally say that wasn't the most formative experience for me. It really was Howard. And so shout out to HBCUs. Love wherever you go to school, but like for those of you that made that choice, I see you, I feel it, and yeah, I'm really glad I did.
For sure. And I can definitely relate to everything you said. Throughout my Spelman experience, I've definitely felt similar, feelings and things like that. But just to pivot a little bit with Harvard. So how do you think your Harvard Law School experience, what effects do you think that had on your career specifically?
In close company, I'm going to say something to you all really bluntly, and then I'll answer it in a more professional way. I have jokingly described Harvard as like the closest thing that I imagine is like being white, which is like the presumption of competence attaching to me, whether it was earned or not. So from an external perspective, it fires people up. And I have feelings about that because people don't react the same way when I tell them I went to Howard. They have no idea which of those institutions has been like deeply fundamental in my story. But when you get rid of the external perspective, Harvard was a really important time in my life, actually, because I came out of there a pretty dangerous debater, really able to engage in argumentation in a way that's been very useful in the legal and the business world. And then maybe just generally speaking, I became a really good problem solver because of the people I went to school with. Like we have all these celebrity professors, but really my classmates, it's like the whole iron sharpens iron thing. That's like really, really true there. And I was really surprised the extent to which it wasn't like a campus full of Poindexters, right? It was like a lot of people who are complicated and who are three-dimensional like me. And we have vigorous debates with folks that you totally disagreed with, but like you knew you couldn't just attack people's character. You get laughed out the classroom. Things you'd never see in Washington today. Like we were doing that in school. And so what I liked about the Harvard experience was not only the ways in which I grew intellectually, but in some respects, it almost gave me a glimmer of continuing to believe that America could be more than what it is, because that was a place where you had a ton of people who were diametrically opposed, having reasonable and vigorous debates about hard stuff. And things were better as a result of it. It wasn't the food fights that you see when you turn on CNN or Fox or watch any Sunday morning news show.
Great answer. And that was really insightful. And now just to focus on your experience with Pizza Hut. So since Pizza Hut in 2016, you have held multiple leadership positions. What advice would you give to young professionals looking for upward mobility in new professional roles?
Yeah, that's a great question, actually. I think I would say a couple things. I think the first one is, don't be afraid to go somewhere that scares you. So there were not a lot of people could make sense of me leaving this really big law firm where I had a really good practice and was doing interesting work and going to a pizza company. In fact, God bless my grandmother, I jokingly told her that I was going to deliver pizza. And she was just like, baby, as long as you're making honest money, like that's okay. If I could tell, she was like, what are you doing? But the insight for me there was like, I had a vision for myself there and I believed that I could be something different. And so the first piece is like, don't be afraid to go to places that feel like you're zigging when everybody else is zagging. That's been my story for a long time. I think the next piece of advice is, in picking a place, pick a place that you believe is going to see you in the fullness of who you are. I was really attracted to Pizza Hut because when they made that decision to hire me into that first legal job, like, is a really critical part of what we do. Like, we're a franchisor, so a franchise lawyer should know what they're doing. They made that decision even though they know I had no experience in that practice area. And it made me realize they had evaluated what they thought I was capable of, not only what my resume said. And so I believe that if they did that out the gate, if I proved to them my worth, they would continue to make bets on me. Like, I'm a chief operating officer today, and I wasn't in operations before this, but the company has been that type of experience for me. I think the last thing I'd say is really understand the difference between sponsoring and mentoring, and try to go to places or identify when you get someplace who can be a good sponsor for you and who can be a good mentor. And a mentor is someone who can just like help you along the way. And a sponsor will throw a chair for you when the doors are closed in a room that you don't have access to. And I've had sponsors who have helped other people who didn't know me see a Black kid with the name Shaquan really clearly, even when we were saying we're going to go take him and put him in something he's not done before. So those would be the things I'd hit on that. Super
great advice. I was definitely taking mental note of that. So now, as a previous chief equity officer, you championed and promoted Pizza Hut's equity and inclusion vision. Throughout your career, how important was it for you to find a company whose values and visions aligned with yours?
Very important. I think, I don't know, you didn't ask my advice on this, but I think I'd say, especially as we see the economy reimagining itself in light of the Great Resignation and everything that we've seen since 2020, people finally paying attention to some factors that have been very existent in our economy forever. But for every reason, when we were at home in a pandemic, scared about COVID, we were able to see some things more clearly. I'd say you have the right to find a place whose vision and their values align with your vision and your values. So the first thing, Brittany, is that it presumes that you have some sense of what your values are and a sense of what your vision is. And I write those things out because they become more real for me. And so when I do that, when I engage in an interview process or when I am being recruited, I go and find ways to ask questions to see how these things match up. One example is like, especially now with two young kids, I would never go to another place that was a FaceTime culture, which is like, if you're not in here all the time, you're not doing work. I'll never accept that again because I want to show up as a present father. You know what I mean? That's the value that I have for that. So It's very important. And those are the things that I think make your job more livable when it inevitably becomes difficult. Because like work is hard. You spend more time working than anything else in real life,
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. Just like putting your values first before anything. So I definitely resonate with that. And you have a clear passion for civic engagement. What would you say has been the most exciting policy-focused project that you have worked on thus far?
That's a good one too. I have a tie in my head, but I think I'll go. So I I was the chair of something called the South Dallas Fair Park Opportunity Fund at the city. And so basically South Dallas Fair Park is historically Black, and you can imagine, therefore, disinvested part of our city, just south of downtown. It's where the state fair is. This was a thriving Black neighborhood. We plopped the state fair in the middle of it, and then put a highway through it. We know what that does when you put pavement over people. This trust fund was, or the Opportunity Fund, as we rebranded it, was responsible for investing city dollars into small businesses and nonprofit partners with a laser focus on revitalizing that area and giving the people that live there an opportunity to have a say in the future of the neighborhood that they cherish. I did some really good work with a number of other people who have been appointed by city council to reimagine that fund, and then to redirect those funds to people who are on the ground doing things like public safety work in the name of community neighborhoods and communities, saying, you know what, we are going to build out a neighborhood watch and look out for ourselves. Things that challenged the status quo around lending practices for a dentist office that wants to come and move into that part of the city. We give you a low interest loan when the capital markets haven't caught up to the idea your business would be in a place like that yet. We come in and give you a loan at a certain percent, and then now you got a business there, a small business who's providing employment opportunities for people and services, those things. So that was a meditation, bringing on the idea that governments can't do everything. Governments shouldn't do everything. Governments can extend themselves in thoughtful ways when they partner with the right people who are properly invested in the areas that they serve. And we got a chance to live that out with that. So I was really excited about that work. Spent a few years getting it stood up.
That sounds amazing. I think like the racial wealth gap is very prevalent. So it's amazing that you are working to like bridge those gaps. So now to focus on a little more about our program. So the program has a primary focus on the importance of financial literacy. What key financial or investment advice would you give to professionals at the start of their career?
That saving and investing are different things. And I'm still preaching to myself on this because, I mean, like I told you all, it's not that I ever was lacking things growing up, but I didn't come from the abundance of like many of my classmates at Howard, certainly my classmates at Harvard, people who I live in the C-suite with now. And so there are times in which I still have a mentality of like, let me protect what I have, as opposed to taking some reasonable risks that allow me to grow money aggressively. So what I would say is develop a strategy, understand like your risk tolerance, understand your appetite for reward seeking, and then overlay that on what you do with your money. So you don't just you don't even always hit singles if you just save your money, for example, right? And so when you talk about trying to grow wealth, especially intergenerational wealth, it's got to come from strategies that are focused on longer plays that have aggressive returns and being prepared to lose things. But you got to be honest about your circumstance. And so even coming right out of Harvard, like I had so much law school debt that I wasn't in a place to play as aggressively as I am now. And so I had to be honest with myself about that. But a lot of times our people just don't have strategies because like my parents weren't in a position to teach me these things. And my classmates' parents, like in law school in particular, were. And so closing the information gap for yourself is probably the first step. And then overcoming whatever the categories are you break. And mine was like, almost like I don't have enough to do this mindset, when if you're honest with yourself and have a strategy, you probably can do some things differently and get some better results. Does that make sense what I'm saying? For sure.
It's kind of like you need a plan, you have a platform, but you need a plan. So strategy is very important. So, thank you for that. Yeah. And most of our scholars have 2.5 months until finals and 3 months until graduation. Super excited about that. But there are 3 things that suggest that we do before graduation.
Don't go to the club the night before graduation and be out till 5 like I was and sleep all through graduation. My mom she was so mad at me about that. My serious answer. Don't let it pass you by. So in my fraternity, our hymn begins with the words "college days swiftly pass." That's really true. Like when these neos who are crossing today, like call me, I look back at just how much time has passed since I left the yard. And so in the last 3 months, don't be so in a hurry to get to the next thing that you don't savor these moments. That doesn't sound like something people typically tell you because it feels like soft or squishy or whatever. And I'm telling you, having being where your feet are planted right now is a really important thing. And you won't regret that. So live in that and walk in that and enjoy the time you have in the yard. That's the first piece. I think the second piece is have a vision for what you think success looks like for yourself, and don't have it be tied explicitly to income or title. You know, you have a chance to sit here and try to see the end from the beginning, because what happens when you get to the end of your life, you're going to look back and think about the impact that you had, not a lot of the things that we're wired to chase when we come out of college, right? So I'd say, think now about the impact you want to have. Like, so for me, I moved from being like, oh, I want to be the CEO next, to I want to be the critical driver of our business and our culture. Or I want to use Pizza Hut as a way of liberating frontline workers to get on a path of economic prosperity by giving them access to da-da-da-da. Like, I think in those terms. I wish I spent more time thinking like that in college, as opposed to, I want to be like the president of the United States, for example, because of the choices I made probably would have been a little bit more thoughtful. So take that moment to think of this. That's the second thing. And I think the third thing is, don't forget, especially if you go to an HBCU, don't forget what you owe your institution when you leave, and develop a plan now how to reinvest in it, because those institutions require us to be invested in it. So we don't just look and admire the problems that they have, that we're part of the solution, because our institutions have come out, have grown out of great sacrifice and great struggle, and largely are miracles to still be in existence. So be a part of extending that miracle. And you got to decide at 21, 22, that that's who you're going to be when you are able, to contribute that way financially.
For sure. That's great advice. I graduate in May, and I took note of everything you said, especially the first piece of advice. I think COVID took so much away from us. So being in the moment and just appreciating everything is very, very important. But
Absolutely.
It's been a pleasure speaking with you. Thank you so much for all your insight. Truly appreciate it. I think Mr. Sanders has some more questions for you.
Okay. Thank you, Brittany.
Well, I love the rapport that you two have. Brittany, if you could also read the questions that were submitted by our attendees, that would be great. Do you have access to those?
I would love to read them. Do I just look in the chat for those questions?
Let's see. I have them. I'll just go ahead and do it in real time. Okay, right. Shaquan.
Yeah, shoot.
Question number 1. Knowing what you know now, what is one thing you wish you had done differently in your 20s?
Examine the power of grace more. Like, grace has been a really critical part of me growing up, and like really becoming a man. Grace with myself, grace with other people. And that just wasn't something I really had. I didn't have that in my honest vocabulary outside of like amazing grace growing up. And when you get older, you start to recognize the role that plays in your life. So examining the power of grace is something I wish if I could do it over again, I'd probably be way better if I had gotten to that faster in life.
Okay. Priscilla Lynn asks, how do you identify someone as a mentor?
Yeah, so usually I think a mentor is someone who has navigated the terrain you're trying to navigate. And that's why, like, a really well-intentioned person who has no clue what it's like to try to move through a large corporation can be a great mentor for me. They could be an incredible supporter and friend, but you haven't navigated the terrain like this. You haven't been Black trying to move through spaces that weren't necessarily designed for you. It's hard to say it's a mentor. So identify those people who have navigated the terrain. And then the next piece of it, Edward, is that they would be willing to share of themselves. Not everybody is willing to do that. So don't waste your time with people who are pretending like they want a mentor to say that they are, but if they aren't investing the time.
Most definitely, most definitely. Okay, the next question is, what are some best practices and strategies for promotion as scholars navigate the role of being a new employee? So how do they level up once they get in?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's really important to come in, Edward, understanding what success looks like for your role. So, and the reason why that's important is because a lot of times I find people come in and they're playing a game they haven't been asked to play. You can't win that in that case. So real clarity around what success looks like is really useful. And then you do have to relentlessly pursue that. There's still no, I hate to sound like my dad, but there really is no substitute for like a relentless work ethic in these spaces. And so overlaying that over and understanding what you're asked to do is really important. I think the next thing that's useful for people that are new employees is to engage in like a real deep ongoing learning exercise. So like as a lawyer, even though I don't practice, I still go through my continuing legal education to make sure that my bar card stays up to date, which requires me to consistently engage new content that refines my skills, refines my thinking, you know what I mean? And so I think people as new employees should understand what is that skill set of learning that should be evergreen in your environment and be acquiring that as opposed to just going to work and then leaving. Like, because I can promise you someone else who is like your colleague right now is taking that mindset and they're thinking that this is what they need to do to move forward. And so you can keep pace with that person, you can let them pass you by, or you can advance past them.
Okay, next question is, what is the hardest part of navigating corporate America?
I think the honest and I want to be sensitive in saying this because it could sound crazy. Like here I am, I'm in my 30s. I'm the chief operating officer at this organization, but I do think being Black and navigating those spaces has been the hardest part for me because it's not always easy to have been authentic along the way in these roads. And when you're not being yourself, that stuff is exhausting. Like work is hard enough. This is why, Edward, like I committed myself to showing up authentically. Like the more senior I become, the more I lean into who I am. So I create categories for other people to be themselves as well and don't have to deal with the mental burden of like, do I show this or do I show that? But that's been the hard thing because that's, generally speaking, corporations weren't designed for people who come from my background and probably many of the backgrounds of folks on this call. And knowing that that's true and having that on your back while trying to substantively excel and accelerate has been the hardest part for me. I tell you what, I'm grateful for what God has done for and through me in these roles, but I'd be remiss if I didn't acknowledge that that's been the hardest part.
Okay. Clayton Bugs asks, what are your current goals and how are you trying to better yourself? So CEO of Pizza Hut, CEO somewhere, or some other aspirations?
So let me take how I better myself first. The answer I'm going to give you on this is radical and revolutionary for me. Maybe not for other people, but for me. The first thing I'm doing, and I have sucked at it I've sucked at it since January. But the first thing I'm doing to better myself is making space for grace for myself. I have very exacting conversations with the man in the mirror. And there have been times that's been really useful and it's been fuel, and then other times where it's been exhausting. And so I'm having to deal with that. Like, so self-care and grace for myself is like the first thing I'm actually doing to better myself. The next thing is making space for healthy activity. Being deeply committed to me for exercise or basketball or space for things that like pour into me. Because what I've found is when I have made space for those things, I've been way better in the sleepless nights. I've been way better in the boardroom in the morning by having to put those things first. And then from a substantive standpoint, I try to engage in a pretty relentless schedule around reading or digesting or consuming material that's useful. So right now, like I'm obsessing over a bunch of restaurant podcasts. And then I've got this book. It's not like mind blowing or anything like that, but it's called Principles by this cat, Ray Dalio. And it's useful for me because it's causing me to think about what are the rules I would put in place to break ties when there's tension between like all the different things you give them at different times. So like that type of self-learning is one category. My goals. I really have gotten out of the business of titles. Like that's not, I really wasn't kidding when I said that. But I have committed myself to is the next thing I do will be a growth opportunity. And it will be an opportunity to do something that I can't do today. And so what I want out of the next thing is a larger platform to drive more business results and to drive cultural outcomes from a bigger platform that resonate deeply with people who could be liberated by someone being in a role like mine.
Okay. We have a question about, let's see. What advantages and disadvantages would you say there are to switching companies to gain higher positions versus trying to go to attain higher roles within the company? Moving up or moving out?
That's a super interesting question. There's not a right answer because, you know, corporations are organisms, and that answer plays different ways in different spaces. What I can tell you is, if you're someone like me who is charting a path that's not based on substantive experience per se, on what you've done, you might want to think about moving in a given place. So like the reality is, if I were to jump from being a lawyer at Pizza Hut and go to anywhere else, there's no way the next thing they give me is, okay, go run Pizza Hut Express. That's not happening. And it's probably not likely that as the chief equity officer of Pizza Hut, the next thing I get at another place is chief operating officer. Like, we all know the game. That's not the case. So don't be afraid to move places to attain bigger scope. But the value of being in one place and climbing is that if you found a place that can see you clearly and is willing to invest in you and take risks with and on you, that can outpace, like that can cause an accelerated path that may outpace what you would do in the free market. So you got to hold those things in balance. If I wanted to do the exact same thing, I probably would have been way more likely to switch around. But when I knew that I wanted to go from being a business litigator to where I am today, doing it in a place that was like, okay, we get him and he's a quantity that we understand and we want to invest in, it made sense for me to stay in one company.
Okay. Another scholar, Shayla Richardson, wants to know, has COVID-19 affected Pizza Hut positively or negatively or what?
I'll be careful because, we're publicly traded, and don't want anybody to be exposed to any information that's not in the market yet. But here's what I would say. The answer is yes, it has affected us, and it's affected us positively and negatively. On the positive side, which is much more public, has been, if you were to look at our system sales today and compare where they were, a couple years before COVID, you can see that our business has accelerated. And the reason why it's accelerated is because we are, when you think about pizza in our category, we're primarily what we call HMR, which is home meal replacement. So that's going to be delivery, that's going to be carry out. So in the pizza category, we got to that way faster than the rest of food did. Like, everybody's on DoorDash and stuff now, but we have, companies like us, we've dealt with our own delivery fleet and all these sorts of things. So when people got scared of going and sitting down places and said, bring food to me, they did it with people who had delivery infrastructure, and they did it with people who were brands that they trusted. We were fortunate to be both. And so it inured to our benefit in that way. In terms of challenges, I just say, just consider what you hear about supply chain difficulties. COVID has a labor shortage impact on everyone, including people who supply restaurants, who work in restaurants, and all these sorts of things. And so that obviously challenges your ability to service demand, for example. And so if you can't service demand, you can imagine some difficulties that exist as a result.
Okay.
Hope the answer made sense to whoever asked it.
Scholar Jihad Miller would like to know, how do you deal with stressful situations?
Prayer is an important factor for me. Exercise is another important factor. And then the third one that is, again, radical for me is talking about it with people. I think my natural reaction is to hold it and be like, my shoulders are broad enough, but I've tried to get in the exercise of dropping that off in front of people that I trust, who can help me either work through it in an extroverted way or say it out loud. And sometimes people even pick up some of the stuff for you. But my old instincts to turn inward have not been helpful in that. So I've had to reimagine myself.
Okay. Scholar or alumna, Skylar Smith, in summary, wants to know, is there anything that you learned in your time at Howard that stuck with you and has guided you throughout your career as to grow professionally and internally?
Yeah, absolutely. So when I got to Howard, the type of learning that I engaged in, Edward or Skylar, who asked that, the type of learning I engaged in was category breaking for me. So like I made really good grades in high school, and that was on what I was taught. And then when I got to Howard, my professors were exposing me to things, theories, and actual facts and events that I had never had to wrestle with before that caused me to see the world way more vividly. And so the takeaway from that was to not accept surface answers or surface explanations for things. And the way that's benefited me has been like in law school, I've always been a person like to go deeper when I'm reading something to understand why this case says that and what were the set of background facts. And I apply that type of thinking into law, into business, and all these factors. But Howard was the place where they were like, man, you can't always just take it as you get it. Like the game is deeper than that. And I think you all understand the dynamic that I'm making. Like, you know, I never heard of Greenwood in North Texas growing up. You know what I mean? Like I didn't have categories for all the things that the Underground Railroad actually. I didn't know people like Ida B. All the names on the campuses, Elaine Locke, Ida B. I didn't know these things until I got to school. And so I realized there was a whole world out there that I had not engaged. I thought I'd mastered it because of the grades. And in fact, what it demanded of me was like a deeper desire to learn more and to go and get that. That's
okay.
How.
Got a couple more questions. Let's see. Someone wants to know, are you, Pizza Hut, looking for any supply chain graduates? Asking for a friend, LOL.
We're always looking for talent.
Okay, we'll connect you with that scholar.
Yeah, we're always looking for talent.
What are some great reads for our budding C-suite scholars? And also, I have a personal question. If you can tell us in a minute, how does a scholar make it from entry level to the C-suite?
Yeah.
What's the best strategy for that?
Was the first question was, what am I reading? Is that what it was?
Yes. What are some great reads for our budding C-suite scholars?
Yeah. So like I showed you, I'm in principles right now. I'm in the middle of that. That's actually pretty useful. There's a book that's actually randomly very helpful. It's very long, fair warning. It's called Team of Rivals. It's by Doris Kearns Goodwin, and it's about Abraham Lincoln and his cabinet. And truthfully, like it kind of hits the next question. When you talk about going from being entry level, especially to, you know, getting into the C-suite at 30, there are a lot of things about the way he approached his cabinet, many of whom thought that he was like an ignorant country lawyer, and ultimately become very loyal to him and learn how to use them in ways that were productive for what he needed to get done in his administration. There's some really good learnings in that for me. And I think that's useful for people as well. So it's not about someone, I don't readily identify with Abraham Lincoln, but the examination of what's going on in is really important. I actually think the audacity of hope is another really important one for me. And I've got Barack's latest one here that I'm also going through. I can't remember what it's called, A Promised Land. You know, he resonates with me in a lot of, like, I do find him identifiable. And these aren't like business books, but the principles you can get out of them are very, very useful. So those are the ones that I throw out there. Then to the question of how do you go from point A to point Z, entry level to whatever, you know, there's this thing called a value proposition, which is there are like things, and then there are things with value propositions. Things with value propositions are useful because they have intrinsic value and they stand for something that's useful in an environment. I think it's one way to move and navigate is to always know what your value proposition is. The business is different because I'm here, and the business is different because I'm here because I fill in the blank. You have the right to think about that as a 22-year-old person who's coming in the door, and then be flexible to have that evolve over the time. One of the things I had to do was recognize that there are times where the value proposition needs to shift. So like, you know, I'll just give you an example for some folks that want to be lawyers. When you go from a law firm into a business and you're a lawyer, the value proposition can't just be, oh, you're a primo researcher and writer and you can identify problems. It pivots to, can you help me identify risk? Can you create a framework? And then can you facilitate freedom for me to take risks that can get my business ahead? So having a clear sense of your value proposition and being willing to adjust it with the moments and then add things to your skill set to allow it to move is a real way to chart a path for yourself, I'd say.
Okay. Final question. How would you describe your personal leadership style, and what have you learned so far managing people and teams? And that's from Brandon Stewart from Duquesne University.
My personal leadership style: high accountability, high humility, I think I attempt to be, and high on collaboration. So high accountability. I shield all blame to the extent I can from my team, and try to give all the credit away. And what I find when I do that is it gives people more space to innovate when they know that I've got their back and that they don't have to live under the rock of consequences of trying hard and getting something wrong. So I have an accountability thing where like the buck stops with me. And if something goes really well, you just share the credit because that goes to people's benefit. The high humility or low ego thing, you know, I think a lot of us, we're humans, right? So we all have an ego. When I talk about having high humility, I talk about like being like radically open-minded, showing up and really sitting in the reality that I don't have all the answers. There's no amount of school I could have gone to that can make me know how to make pizza better than Miss Martha, who's been at Fort Wayne Pizza Hut for 42 years. It don't matter that she didn't go to Howard and go to Harvard. I cannot do her job better than her. So when I'm talking about what's the next process I'm going to introduce for making dough, if I don't have the humility to listen to someone like Miss Martha, I'm out of my mind. So that's where high humility is important. And then high on collaboration. It's really easy for leaders to get stuck in functional silos and say, okay, this deals with operating. So like I can't listen to anything my CMO said, my chief marketing officer says, or our chief financial officer says. No, I don't play that game. High collaboration allows me to bring in a lot of different points of view to get to the right outcome. I'm outcome focused and like credit agnostic, basically.
Okay. Well, we appreciate that. Any other final words as we close out?
Was there a Harvard question in the chat? I thought I saw something pop up about Harvard and.
Let's see.
Oh yeah, I see it from Priscilla.
Okay.
Yeah.
There we go. That's a good one.
It is, and you know, I'll tell you just in answering that, one of the things I've battled with is like in spaces like this, how do I like openly embrace my HBCU love without making people who are at PWI feel like they're isolated from what I'm saying? And so ultimately what I've settled on is like, we've all made our choices. It's totally fine for me to talk about where I am. The interesting thing about Harvard is that it gave me both experiences. My advice for folks at PWI, my wife went to Harvard for undergrad as well. And we talk about the different dynamics in our undergrad experiences. Can't talk about I don't know the answer to that from an undergrad. I think coming at it as like a man who had worked for 4 years after undergrad and then went into law school, I think some of the sort of self-assuredness I brought to the table may not be where someone is at age 18. But I think I'd say this: try to find your true north. And your true north is sort of your highest and best use, your set of ideals, your way of moving in the world. And don't let, this is true of an HBCU, by the way, but don't let a PWI shape that, because the value set in a majoritarian culture may not inherently value who you are and what you were made to be and what you think is valuable. And in doing that, it's probably important to surround yourself with people, whether who look like you or not, but probably share your values that foster an environment of safety for you pursuing authenticity, for you pursuing intentionality, for you walking in humility. It's important anywhere. I do think it's critically important for folks at PWIs, and they had to tap into some of that when I went to law school. But the true north is the answer. And you can't let institutions dictate your true north, especially when they're not entirely synced with who you are, who you're made to be, and what may be unique about your identity.
Okay. Can our scholars find you on LinkedIn or anywhere?
Yeah, so it's just Shaquan Lewis on LinkedIn. My social media presence is like not like our PR folks stay on me about it. I'm trying to use Twitter and all this stuff more.
Okay.
But I'm not consistent there. But I am consistent on LinkedIn. I'm happy to connect with people. And just let me know let me know if you send a connection that you were here today so I can not accidentally miss it. Because sometimes I have a hard time working through all of them. But I would love to connect with the folks that are here and follow you and be helpful
Okay.
and cheer you on.
Thank you. Well, we appreciate you taking time out of your busy schedule to speak with our scholars and entrepreneurs and innovators about your journey from Mississippi, Texas to Pizza Hut in Texas, and sharing your experience in between. We look forward to our scholars being able to connect with you and let you know about their journeys as they progress in their careers. But thank you again. And scholars, thank you for attending, and make sure that your name is reflected in name box so that we can give you credit, and you will be hearing from us fairly soon about the quiz and assessment for this project. Thank you so much. We look forward to seeing you at our next session.